Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LAEDC's Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation's Together for LA webinar series. Today's topic is key takeaways from the pandemic, preparing for the next disaster. And we have a special speaker, one of our Together for LA partners, the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, and two very exciting speakers that I will introduce in just a moment. For those that don't know, LAEDC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization who champions equitable economic growth across the Los Angeles region. We have a website that I would like to introduce you to. Please visit laedc.org/coronavirus. The website is essentially a small business resource hub. As we continuously learn about resources, we simply put them on the website for you to filter based on resource of choice as well as your industry. So please take a look at the website after the presentation, where you'll find a great deal of resources to take advantage of. I am Angela Amirkhanian, Program Manager for the Together for LA program. Together for LA is one of LAEDC's Small Business Assistance Program, but this one is especially unique because it is a strategic partnership specifically focused on strengthening and supporting women and diverse-owned small businesses all across LA County as we strive to recover from the economic crisis brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. Technical assistance and connections to small business resources are made available through a generous grant from Wells Fargo's Open for Business Fund. Once again, the program is a strategic partnership with organizations that have come together to assist women and diverse-owned small businesses, including the LA Chamber, LISC LA, ISD, as well as today's presenter, the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society. Like I mentioned, we offer complimentary and confidential technical assistance to businesses of all sizes and industries. Here are some of the areas that we specialize in. What we do is we are happy to sit down with you and discuss your needs. So based on your needs, we'll connect you to a resource that you would benefit from. And these can range from workforce training and development, tax incentives, access to capital, grant and loan opportunities, and so on. We also connect you to resources and various entities that can assist you. For example, if you're interested in workforce development, we can connect you to organizations such as the America's Job Centers of California, on-the-job training, recruitment, screening, and so on. So it's very customized to your needs. Moving on to the reason why we have gathered, today's presentation topic is on key takeaways from the pandemic and preparing for the next disaster. I'd like to introduce John Bwarie. He is Deputy Director and co-founder of the Dr. Jones Center for Science and Society, who has worked alongside Dr. Jones since 2007 and was instrumental in creating the Great Shakeout. So John will guide us through the presentation, as well as tell us about the center and introduce Dr. Jones.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela, for all your coordination and making this happen. Welcome, everyone. Great to see some familiar names in the program today. For those who don't know, the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society has been around for about 5 years. And the mission is to really see that science can be used in the creation of more resilient communities, that all the work we do, from small business community to nonprofits to civic life as a whole, is able to be informed by the science that includes disaster science, physical science, social science, in order to build a more resilient community. And that's the work we've been doing day in and day out since we founded the center, based on the decades of work that Dr. Jones had undertaken while at the U.S. Geological Survey. And so today we're honored to present some of the findings on the pandemic and how it relates to the next disaster we might face. And Dr. Jones, if you're not aware, has spent nearly 4 decades in Southern California in this role of communicating key information to stakeholders through the media, through direct conversation with elected and appointed leaders, and in collaboration with nonprofit and community partners. And so it's my honor to have Dr. Jones really be the main presenter today. She and I are going to co-present the information in order to provide a look at what we've learned from the pandemic and how we can apply that as leaders of small business and community in order to be ready for what's next. because we spend a lot of time talking about what's happening, but the next is still coming. So I'm going to actually ask that we switch screens for a moment. And as we do that, sort of set the stage for you a bit. So as we said, today we're talking about key takeaways from the pandemic as we prepare for the next disaster, whether it's an earthquake, a flood, or the next pandemic. But let's take back for a minute. Before the pandemic, we always spent our time mostly talking about earthquakes. It's where Dr. Jones got her start. It's where I actually started working with Lucy. We actually generated a synthetic earthquake model that told us what would happen if the southern San Andreas actually ruptured from the Salton Sea up through Fort Tejon. What would that look like? And basically the result is nearly 2 minutes of shaking across the region with 1,800 dead, nearly more than 250,000 displaced, homeless, no houses, $120 billion in direct losses, doubled that, another $120 billion in business disruption, and 18 million people being affected, directly feeling strong shaking. That's from the Salton Sea all the way up through the Los Angeles basin and into Ventura and from the Los Angeles basin into Ventura and Santa Barbara. And so for those that are here with us today, you can see the animation on your screen showing the shaking. The earthquake started more than a minute ago, but the strong shaking, actually shaking it all, hasn't really reached downtown Los Angeles. It's not till about 75 seconds from when the earthquake starts that the earthquake strong shaking reaches downtown. And as you watch your screen, this is one of many animations that was created to demonstrate what would happen when the big one happened. Not if, but when. And this is all based on scientific research of what the ground motions would be. And so you can see here, more than 90 seconds since the earthquake started, and the strongest shaking is reaching central Los Angeles and the Los Angeles basin. So we know what could happen, and this is what we modeled back in 2007, 2008. Fast forward to 2020, we had a pandemic. Now, we didn't do the modeling on the pandemic, but what actually happened in the pandemic didn't surprise those of us who've been studying disasters. So today, we're going to go through 3 key points. We're going to compare the impacts of the pandemic to an earthquake and actually other disasters as well, and how that plays out. Number 2, we're going to see what insights from the pandemic we can carry forward and what we can take and lessons learned as we prepare our business communities and our small businesses for what's next. And number 3, we're going to provide tools that help businesses and help those who help businesses prepare for what's coming, what the next disaster might be. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lucy to begin a bit about when we talk about disasters, what we're really talking about. Lucy?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I realize that when we talk about the pandemic as a disaster, that doesn't seem quite right to a lot of people, because when we think about disasters, we really often focus on the suddenness. An earthquake, we go in a second from everything's normal to suddenly everything's changed. And that's often our emotional place where we, with what we feel about disasters. But when you think about what can happen to us, you start realizing that the time frame can vary much more. I mean, an earthquake's in a minute, a flood will be taking place in days, wildfires will go on for days and maybe into weeks. Volcanic eruptions, luckily we don't have to deal with those much in Southern California, so we don't have personal experience, but those can be going on, for months. And the pandemic, it's already gone on for 2 years. Another disaster that we will be thinking about and need to be is when you start thinking about climate change. It has all of the same characteristics of risk to humanity, but it's now happening over a century or more. And I think that's the commonality between these type of events. It's danger to us, the fear that danger produces in us, and our responses to that fear. Now, we fear different things, and in fact, one of the differences between disasters is not just the time, but how it's manifested. So if we look at a few disasters in the Los Angeles area, think about what happened in the pandemic and compare it to our model of what a big San Andreas earthquake would be like. We also have a model of what a big flood would be like. Now, there's a bit of a different scale. The numbers I'm going to give you for the pandemic are just Los Angeles County. The shakeout earthquake is happening over several counties of Southern California, and the arc storm modeling took place over the whole state. But what you'll see is that they all create chaos and havoc and problems, but in different ways. So if you look at fatalities, that's often the way we internalize thinking about a disaster, right? The pandemic dwarfs what the earthquake's going to do. Our estimate for the shakeout earthquake is 1,800 dead. The Great San Francisco earthquake was 3,000 dead. You know, if we really push it and try to think about the worst earthquake we could create, and that would be one right under Los Angeles County when we have a lot of people, we might be able to get up to 15,000 dead. We killed more people in LA County just in the last 2 years from COVID than we will ever do from an earthquake. But if you look at some of the other characteristics, homelessness, in fact, 20,000 people became homeless during the pandemic in Los Angeles County. But in the earthquake, we expect over 250,000 households to be so badly damaged that people can't continue to live there. Whether they will become homeless, whether they'll be in shelters, whether they'll leave the area. We have a lot of people displaced from their homes. And actually in the flood, the estimate is we'd be evacuating 1.5 million people. Not so many in Los Angeles County, many of them are different places, but 24% of the buildings in the state of California could be damaged by floodwaters and might make them temporarily uninhabitable. Now, when you look at the physical losses, of course, the pandemic didn't go in and damage something. And by comparison, the earthquake is much more, and the flood even more than that, because of course it's going over the whole state. But instead of direct physical losses, if we look at economic losses, remember hearing that in the earthquake, it doubled the losses. The business disruption doubled the losses from utility disruption in an earthquake. It doubled the losses, which were much bigger, of course, in the flood because of displacement from the flood damage. But look at what happened to businesses in the pandemic. 1/3 of California's restaurants closed. You know, there's another FEMA estimate that 40% of small businesses in a badly affected area from a physical disaster don't come back. So what we're looking at in business disruption is actually very similar. And although we're afraid of that shaking, we're afraid of being crushed, in fact, much of the damage to our communities is going to come from that business disruption. So if we now see the pandemic from the perspective of a disaster, what can we learn from the pandemic to help us going forward and thinking about what will be happening when the earthquake occurs and what will be reappearing in how we as a society are dealing with that disaster? And to do this, we need to start from looking at how we think about risk. This is something that evolved very early in human development. We were faced with predators, and we have a very rapid system to get us to respond to that. The psychologists called it affective risk perception. By this, they mean that it's emotionally based. It's what we evolved to deal with danger. It's what always comes up because it's at a pretty low level in the human mind construction. It's not that it's emotional, but rather it's created by how things feel, right? And that's needed to be able to be fast and instinctive to respond to these types of dangers. So let's look at that and compare it to the analytical system, because as humans evolved, we also developed essentially a parallel way of thinking about risk. And that was using our logical minds, where we could go and measure what the faults are doing, come up with a rate at which earthquakes happen, and we can now give you an analytical estimate of the risk that might actually be not the same thing as the affective emotional response. So this is all work from a very famous psychologist named Paul Slovic. You can, if you're interested in this, you can look for him and you'll find a lot more information about it. But if you compare these two approaches that we have, and this isn't to say, oh, like this, here's the general public's emotional way and here's the engineer's logical array. That's not the way it is. We all have both the analytical and the affective system operating in our brains. But the affective system is based on what feels bad, what scares us, what makes us, come up with a really quick response. And that's the key of the affective system. It's very rapid and it's self-evident to us. You experience this is what goes. The analytical system, on the other hand, is based on a reason and analysis, and we have to go through a conscious appraisal of events and analyze whether a connection is actually there. You may have heard, causality versus coincidence. Is this more than a coincidence? Did this cause that? And this is a process, and it's slower. It requires work. And so it is oriented towards delayed action, right? And you don't necessarily believe it. It requires justification via logic and evidence. And when I tell you that the flood is going to cause 4 times as much damage as an earthquake with the same probability, how many of you believe me right off? You probably don't. We have to show you all the data to show how that gets there. The main takeaway here is to remember that everybody has both systems operating in their brains. But when we want to go and act, we need to have a trigger from the affective system. The analytical system alone doesn't tend to lead to the decision to act. We need an emotional engagement to believe that this is worth doing. I mean, you see that predator coming at you, you have a quick fear, you have a real emotional connection. When you look at a building, how emotional are you? Are you worried about being crushed by this building? Probably not. They know it's a long-term process, it's way out there, and it just doesn't connect with us emotionally. And I will say, even, I'm the scientist. I did the analysis. I went through all those numbers and came up with these estimates of how bad it was going to be. But it was still relatively abstract and theoretical. Well, a turning point for me was, as we did this analysis of the big earthquake, was bringing in a specialist who told us what the fire following the earthquake was going to be like. Fire creates a stronger emotional reaction. And what we found in this modeling was that the fires double the losses. The fires get out of control. The fires kill as many people as the earthquake does because you can't get away in time. And really understanding that fire created a deeper emotional reaction in me, and actually led to creating the shakeout drill, to meeting John, to ending up with the work I was doing in the city of Los Angeles. All of that was because I had developed an emotional commitment. Now, I developed an emotional commitment from the numbers because I'm fundamentally a numbers person. And that's not true of most people, or many people, of course. But that idea that we need the emotional connection is really important when we think about how are we going to be getting ready for that next disaster. When you think about the pandemic, do you remember that first month? You remember when we were first hearing these people were dying? It was spreading. We couldn't tell who was infected. We're shutting down our houses. We're using bleach all over our groceries, right? Because we were scared. We had an emotional reaction that got us to do that. As the deaths got normalized, as we just knew that every day we were going to hear about thousands more dead, we stopped having such a deep emotional commitment to what was going on. And I think when you think over the time of the last 2 years, you can see how much that emotional part controls how much we're willing to act. And different people have different emotions. Psychologists have studied this. This is another study, again, with Paul Slovic as part of it. One of the things they were able to show is that people will not choose to act if they don't believe their actions make a difference. They did a study where they showed people one child that you could help. How many of you were willing to step up and give that help? Now, exactly the same presentation, but beside a picture of the one child, they had the 6 children who couldn't be helped because they just didn't have enough scale, feeding poverty or, feeding hungry kids, right? Once people had just the image, even though the words were the same, the image of the people who weren't going to be helped next to the child who they could, they were less likely to do it. And this is one of the things that the psychologists have shown really clearly. You need those emotions, but emotions do arithmetic very, very poorly. You know, we see one child that we can help, we want to do it. We see 1,000 children in trouble, we don't feel 1,000 times more upset. In fact, we might even feel a little less upset because it's just too big to cope with. And they talk about the concept of psychic numbing, that when the scale of the victims get too large, or when you focus on how many people, you actually get less engagement and less emotional connection, less willingness to act. Probably the most extreme case of this that we saw was when the Syrian refugees were coming into Europe. And, you know, people that were in terrible condition, nobody wanted to help them. It was, you know, some people were putting up money, but it was a really, really difficult process. Then this one picture came out. One child washed up dead on the beach, and the number of donations to help the Syrians skyrocketed. And there's this fundamental requirement. We need to personalize the risk, and we need to feel that we're effective. And when you focus on large numbers, you often pull us away from being able to believe either of those two things. So we want emotions that make us feel powerful and make us feel like we can make a difference. I want to focus on 3 emotions, because when we message about the pandemic or we message about the earthquake, we can create those messages on a different emotional boat, if you will, right? We often do it on fear because people are afraid they should want to do something, right? We often think that. But when you look at what happens to people when they experience these different emotions, you start realizing that fear is not the best approach to take, right? We don't like to be afraid. If you evaluate the pleasantness of an emotion, do you want to experience it? We don't like to be afraid. We don't like to be angry. We do like feeling a source of pride, right? Just think about what it's like to experience those emotions. But they also affect our outlook on whether or not our actions will make a difference. Do you feel a sense of individual control? When you're afraid, it's almost by definition, you're feeling out of control. And you probably feel like you can't change it. Right? Many people, when they're afraid, replace it with anger because you feel more in control when you're angry. I think you can, you know, I don't know, think about your children. You've probably seen them doing that, dealing with being afraid by being angry at you instead. Pride in that positive place also makes us feel like we've got control. That's why you're feeling proud of whatever it is you're doing. It's making a difference, right? There's also a question of optimism. Do you believe that your actions will actually make a difference, right? And again, here we are. Fear makes you feel likely that you're not going to be able to have the right outcome. Anger tends to make you feel more in control and therefore more able to do things. And of course, pride does as well. So when we think about the emotions that we're going to be using in dealing with a crisis, fear tends to be the least effective one. You know, and it's a bit of a temporal conundrum, if you will, or just it's really a matter of about time. Fear and that whole affective system is evolved for dealing with the immediate predator. You know, we classically call it the fight or flight syndrome. Right? Fear is geared towards giving you an immediate reaction. But it's when you're dealing with about a longer term risk, right? If you're, you know, the predator right now or the car coming towards me, I have to act immediately to deal with it, right? But if the risk is somewhere off in the future, I now have a third choice. I can choose not to think about it. And this is one of the most important things that we see, is that when something seems fearful, especially when it's combined with other reasons to say, I'm not sure I can make a difference, it's a very strong emotional motivator to just not think about it. When we talk about climate change, this is probably the most common reaction there. If you really think about what's coming, you're going to be really afraid, and you're going to not feel very much in control, and therefore we stop thinking about it. You will also see there's people out there really angry about climate change because this is a way of dealing with that fear. The problem with anger, for all it gives us a sense of control and it's very motivating, it also tends to be divisive. You have to be angry at someone. And most of our solutions are going to come from a community, and anger tends to move us away from this. Now, there's another thing that gets in the way community that's also really common when we're thinking about disasters. Because when we look at somebody in trouble, especially when we see someone else in trouble from a disaster or for whatever reason, right? That can inspire fear. I don't want to be like that person. Well, one way to believe that you're not going to be like that person is to believe that what happened to them was their fault. Think about when you hear somebody has cancer, especially lung cancer. What's your first thought? Well, he smoked, didn't he? Right? You're trying to come up with a reason to blame them. And we do this in disasters. If you think back to Hurricane Katrina, right? We wanted to blame people for being in this position. Why didn't they make a better choice? Why didn't they evacuate? And we ignored the fact that there were 100,000 people who didn't own personal cars, and the only option for evacuating was personal cars. Right? But if we don't think about that and we can blame them, we can think this won't happen to me. And this comes through over and over again in disasters. And I think you can see it really, really clearly with the pandemic. Because we do know we have a lot of people who've chosen not to get vaccinated, even though the vaccines are working really well at preventing disease. And it's quite distributed around the country and quite different. But back to how afraid we were about the pandemic at the beginning and feeling out of control. There was this unseen virus coming at us. Right? If you chose to believe that it wasn't that bad, it's just like the flu. It isn't that bad. I know all these people who got it and were okay. You feel safer. And, controlled by that affective system, we would rather feel safe than be safe. And rejecting the vaccines is a way of feeling safer, because you'd say, it's not that bad. I don't need the vaccine. If you accept the vaccine, you have to admit it really was that bad and really are a lot of people dying. And that actually feels worse. So that's happening on one end of our political spectrum because we've politicized a lot of things. The other end, how many people do you know who are still wearing masks when they're out, biking down the street, who have given up going out, who have not yet gotten back into a restaurant? Those are people whose fear and affective response at least isn't hurting other people like refusing the vaccines might be, but it is hurting their own lives. And each of those is a way to feel safe. Either it's not that bad, therefore I don't need any protection, or it really is that bad and I'm going to protect myself in every way I can. Both of those are expressions of that desire to feel safe that maybe isn't that connected to what the science says is actually the best way that it can do. So let's pull this all together now and start thinking about what this means for looking forward and how we can manage and communicate risk. I think the most important one is it's very, very clear that most policy decisions are driven by the affective risk rather than the analytical risk. Now, if you work hard at it, your analytical risk can inform your affective risk and you have an emotional connection to what the analysis tells you, but that takes a lot of work. And if the affective risk perception is pushing you in a different direction, you're not going to go where the analytical goes. Right? For the affective risk perception to drive us towards action, we have to believe in the efficacy of our actions. We have to believe what we do makes a difference. Fear decreases our belief in efficacy, and uncertainty increases fear. So both the more we try to scare people into doing things is counterproductive. And the more we talk about what we don't know, the more disabling we make this. So for instance, don't try to convince someone to get ready by an earthquake by giving them the probability of whether one will happen, even though that's what us seismologists like to do. We should be giving them instead the evidence of the effectiveness of the tasks, the mitigation, the things that will make it better. You want the efficacy of your actions rather than the probability of the disaster. I think the other thing that's really important to remember here is that patterns that make us feel safe can be more important than what actually makes us safe. And to be aware of that emotional connection and how people see this, that maybe isn't that logical, but that's not the way in which people act in these situations. And just a last point, the larger the number of victims, the less engaged our emotions will be. And that's another problem when we talk about these big scale disasters and when we really need the business community to act together, or the places where we're really trying to function as a community, is because of the scale of it. But the more we think about the large scale, again, the less engaged our emotions will be. So if we put this back together as we thinking about this, I think you can see from the disaster, the longer it goes on from the pandemic, the worse it is. And that's one of the other factors that's really important, that business disruption side of things, which depends upon the duration. So these 2 points are tied together. Business disruption is where we really damage our community, and it's the duration of the disruption that matters. And that's what we've seen with the pandemic. The longer it went on, the worse it got. Now, this might not seem to apply to an earthquake, right? It's going to be over in 2 minutes. Number one, there's also aftershocks. But also the duration of disruption is how long it takes us to get back. And therefore that depends on how much damage we did. So even though we don't have physical damage out of the pandemic, the lesson that the longer it goes on, the longer before you can get your businesses back, the worse the disruption is going to be, the more businesses are going to be taken out. And then I would just end with this point that we'd rather feel safe than be safe. And our jobs as leaders of a community are to align those two, to take the things that actually do make us safer and have people believe and feel that they will be safer because of those actions. John, why don't you pick up here?
So yeah, so as we prepared for today, we know that the audience that we were hoping to talk to was leaders of our business community and business leaders themselves. And so what we're talking about now is how a leader in your community, whether it's, you're a business association, a chamber of commerce, or perhaps another type of association that you're leading others in preparing for what's next and minimizing the impact of the next disaster. Based on what we've just heard from Lucy, here are the things that we should take away from today that you can actually put into action. Number one is to use the right messaging that empowers your members or your affiliates. It's everything Lucy just talked about, right? Providing that emotional connection and using that data judiciously, right? Not overwhelming people with statistics or large numbers, but localizing it and making that emotional connection as we start the messaging on why it matters and what the future might look like. Our next item is to lead by example. So wherever you're here today, right? People model behavior based on others they see that are in positions of authority doing that same action. So if you're the head of a chamber of commerce, if you're the head of your industry association, you need to be practicing the things and showing how easy it is to mitigate the impact of the future disaster by taking steps today that will prevent that. Number three is to develop a cohort. So you don't do it alone. Once you lead by example, get 3, 6, 12, 25, 100 of your members of people that are part of your community to do it together. Because just like it's difficult to look at a big scale of numbers being impacted, it's also difficult to feel like you're all alone trying to make an impact. But when you develop a cohort, like the Lucy Jones Center has done with our community Connected Communities program, people can work together to move forward and address things, and they can support each other. They can share challenges that they have to get to that next level and work together to find solutions. Number four, in addition to a cohort to do this and leading by example, integrate it into your regular work. Don't say today is our time that we're going to talk about building resilience or preparing for the next earthquake or the next disaster, but rather every time there's a meeting, use a moment at the beginning of the meeting to talk about safety. We have a number of utility leaders who do that in our region. Perhaps when you're doing a lunch and learn on marketing, you add a component that's about building resilience. don't just wait for the moment to talk about resilience, but in everything you do, have this be part of your work as an association, chamber of commerce, or leader of your community. Number 5, focus on collective outcomes, just like the cohort does. But more importantly, it's not by taking this action, what does this do for me? But what does this do for me, for my community? So the people you're talking to, the people you're leading to build resilience, to mitigate the impact of what's next, feel pride in what will come, that they feel like the work they're doing is beneficial for the future of the community that they're a part of, that they find a sense of place. And in that sense of place, they work to protect it, preserve it, and make sure it's there for the future.
You know, in the work that I've done about earthquakes, I think back to especially the time I spent at the mayor's office in the city of Los Angeles. And I look back at what happened then with my newer understanding of all these social science implications. And I can recognize that probably the most important thing that happened there was a sense of pride. That when we talked about it, it was about having Los Angeles there for our future. I noticed the Mayor Garcetti would always bring up when we were speaking to groups about it, that both he and I were 4th generation Angelenos, because that was an implicit thing of pride in the community and how it works together. And everything we know when we study disasters is that it's the community that gets damaged by the big scale disasters, and it's the community that provides the resources to recover. And the communities that recover are ones that already have lots of connections between each other, what the social scientists call social capital. The more we're connected, the more we're willing to work to stay here because it's our home and we're all in this together.
So with that, we want to open it to questions and offer the opportunity for you to ask questions via chat or the Q&A section about what's next, about what we experienced, and how the two connect. So any spectrum of those questions would be fine for Dr. Jones or myself, or even more specifically, how you might implement this in the work that you're doing to make sure that you're taking care of your community. None of you would be here today if you didn't have a sense of pride for what you do in your work and the place that you exist in Los Angeles. So how can we help you in the time we have together to get to the next level?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Before we get into the Q&A portion, I just wanted to thank you for that excellent presentation, undeniably excellent information and very encouraging. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I do want to encourage everyone to send your questions in through both or either the chat function or the Q&A function. But John, if you'd like to start us off with a question that you might have for Dr. Jones, or a frequently asked questions that you get from community leaders, we can go ahead and start that conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Angela. I think one of the things that we often hear when we have these kinds of discussions is people, especially when we used to be in rooms together, or even sometimes when we were on screen together, people would look around in disbelief. They would hear what Lucy had to say and feel like, oh my gosh, 2 reactions. Is there really something I can do? And if we know all this, how come we're not able to use it? And I think that's the key here. So Lucy, maybe you could speak for a moment about what it takes to get this information to the, like, how do we start to use it in a way that makes it useful?
Of course, today we really focused some on the things that are keeping us from using it. And I think that feeling of efficacy, as I look back, is realizing that's a big part of the way. And it's, both in climate change and in earthquakes, I've noticed that the scientists are often much more optimistic than the general public. And we tend to do a pretty bad job of communicating that because we always qualify everything, right? Scientists never say anything absolutely. You know, it's always probably it's this, and you know, we always, a fundamental being science is knowing that you could be proved wrong. That's the whole thing of peer review and all of that. So we tend to not be very direct about our statements. But I think if I wanted to share one big thing is it's like these things really do make a difference. You know, it's very hard to see what didn't happen. You don't often get that. You know, you undertake some action, you've strengthened some bridge and it doesn't fall down. Well, it's not like all bridges were falling down and that one stays up. You know, so it's hard to see that that investment made a difference. I'll go out there though and say there's a pandemic lesson. When you look at what now, island countries that had a easier time really isolating things, but I look at New Zealand and the way they shut down so quickly. You know, we shut down, but we didn't quite do it, right? When they did it and really did it, they succeeded. And so the pandemic is actually a place where we get to compare because it became worldwide and every country dealt with it a different way. And, you know, but you then have to follow through. Remember how we all heard Sweden was handling it by letting everybody get sick? Well, in fact, it turns out their outcomes were really bad, right? So we have that evidence. In the earthquakes, they're infrequent enough. It's hard for you to get that direct experience, but the scientists have it. We know what works. And there are some really basic things. And of course, Los Angeles and many other cities now have undertaken mandatory retrofit of soft first story buildings because it really works. And the estimate is actually you get $22 back for every dollar you invest in this in terms of all the disruption that doesn't happen, even taking into account that earthquakes aren't that common. So it's one of the most cost effective and people have really gone and done it. There will be an earthquake at which we'll see, it's like, oh, all of these, look how much better Los Angeles and Pasadena and Santa Monica are because they didn't lose these buildings. It'll be too late, right, for the others if we just wait for the earthquake. And unfortunately, I think that's the biggest issue, isn't it? That emotional connection, we have the emotional connection right after the earthquake. It's easy to see the consequences and it's easy to act then. And it is very hard to get the votes to spend money without that emotional driver of the disaster we just saw.
You know, as I'm listening to Lucy talk and I'm thinking about, you know, what we're really talking about. And I think I want to go back to that early slide you talked about, Lucy, when you said like the damages, the physical damages were minimal. I think about our built environment. And I think about Century City and I think about Hollywood. I think about LAX. I think about the ports, obviously downtown LA and all the sort of suburban centers, right? Warner Center, Glendale,
Right.
et cetera, around the region. When we think about our built environment was not affected by this disaster, yet we had a tremendous amount of death, illness, and emotional drain. In the earthquake or even the flood or the wildfire that will eventually, you know, hit us because of climate change, how do we manage the physical space versus the emotional space? And would you prioritize one over the other in getting ready?
Oh, I would prioritize the emotional space because the physical space is somewhat easier to do. And actually, I guess here's another piece of the work we did at the USGS where we looked at several different disasters. We did 2 earthquake models, one for LA and one for the Bay Area, and then the flood and a tsunami. So we had 4 different cases, similar methodology, but it was like, okay, what's going to be the utility disruption and when are these different businesses going to be able to come back and et cetera. And for quite different reasons, right? You take out different things in the different disasters. Every one of them, the business disruption doubled the losses, at least. And I think that, so, and the business disruption happens for a couple of reasons. One is the things like, you know, utilities disrupted, but the other one is people choosing to leave. You know, if you've now lost enough and I can go and commute, I can work for Google from my parents' home in Illinois, and you get up and you leave, that's a person who's not contributing to the local economy. And the degree to which people leave will really determine our recovery. And that's determined by much of the emotional ability to cope with it. How bad is it going to feel? And, it's easy to say, well, I used to use the line, how many of you will stay when you haven't had a shower in a month? Because we lose our water. Yeah, that could drive you out. But it might also be just you feel too afraid. You don't know how to cope with those aftershocks, and you don't have somebody to talk to. So the emotional connections to the community, something Los Angeles is not well known for developing, right? We all buzz past each other on the freeway. Our image is ones that we don't have emotional connections to each other. If that's really true, we are going to really, really struggle to recover.
So to that point, Angela, can the attendees see who's the attendees, or they only see the three of us? Do they see the list of who's here?
No, you
Okay.
won't be able to see attendees.
Okay, so let me make a point then. So I'm looking at the attendee list, and I recognize a number of these names as being leaders in communities across Los Angeles, whether they're in business. I see some chambers of commerce. I see some nonprofit associations. I see some nonprofit leaders themselves. And I think if you look at this list and there's all our attendees, if this group, for instance, as an example, found a way to connect with each other, we'd be that much stronger. Now, it's going to be difficult because you don't see each other's names to be able to do that. So I think that the call really is to look back at your own organization, that if you look at what's happening in your chamber of commerce and figure, we know a bit about our board. We know our board of directors and the 20 active chamber members, but there's about 300 members that pay their dues that we don't know. And maybe some of them are distant. I think our friends in Hollywood get people from all over the country that join their chamber of commerce, for instance. But there's folks that are in neighborhoods or in office buildings that you don't actually see. The work is to really connect with them, because that connection serves in building resilience for our community, and it serves your purpose as an organization as well. The more engaged they are with the LAEDC, the Hollywood Chamber, the Century City Chamber, the more effective the organization is, and the more connected they will be, the sense of place that they will have when crisis strikes. I think that's what's a key takeaway here, is that the work of association work is the work of resilience building. The more connected you are and engaged they are, the more effort we make in that space, the more resilient we will be when the disaster comes.
Thank you, John. And we have a question that came in. We have a couple questions that I'd like to address to either of you. Would you be able to provide any published references of cost benefit analysis that could be used to perhaps convince a board of directors to budget to create disaster business continuity plans and provide funding to actively practice the plan on a regular basis?
Okay, so I was going to start with there is a report from the National Institute of Building Safety in 2019. I've just put up the link, called Mitigation Saves 2.0. And this was a bunch of engineers going through for all the different perils. So it's done for earthquakes and floods and windstorms, et cetera. And saying, what's the value? And that includes how, the fact that earthquakes don't happen very often. It even includes a discounted rate of money, so that money you spend now is worth more than the money you'd be spending to recover 20 years from now when it happens. So all of that's in there, but it also includes losses beyond just what happens to the building owner or the property owner, and also looks at the disruption to the community and the business disruption losses and all of these things. And so it's a bit more about physical sort of things rather than building, business continuity planning. But that's where I gave that number of $22 saved for each on the software story. They analyzed various mitigation activities individually, and that was one of the most cost-effective ones. Overall, earthquakes come out, it's like $3 or $4 saved for every dollar spent. So there's lots of things that are really worthwhile and that show up in there. The thing about business continuity, the one other thing I would suggest is, I said the USGS created 4 scenarios. The last one was called Haywired, which was about an earthquake on the Hayward Fault. And there's a lot of reports that have been done about with that one. And one of the really important parts of it, and that's, I'm going to try when we're done here to find the details. I've got one link I can give here. You'd have to dig a little to find all of the sub reports from it, but they did a lot more of looking at like community, how well community held together, and this idea of displaced population. So there's a study by Laurie Johnson in Haywired, looking at, actually trying to quantify what might be the population losses that would result from this earthquake. So it's, a hypothetical earthquake, but dig it in detail and you start seeing the impacts of these various factors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. We have time for one more question.
I do see this one about progress
Dorothy.
in handling disasters.
Yes.
So the question is, have you seen any progress? Have you seen important progress in handling disasters during the last 5 years in Los Angeles? In what ways?
I've seen us go forward and back. All right. So I do think that there has been a willingness to grapple with earthquake losses, even though we haven't had a recent earthquake. Between, part of it came out of having shakeout and the drill and the city of Los Angeles, but then, SCAG had a big project and a lot of other cities got engaged. There's an aspect at which we've stepped back, though, and it becomes, I think, there's a lot of things we lost with the pandemic. And when it's like trying to get, you're not going to keep, backup earthquake supplies if you can't afford to put dinner on the table today. And when we are dealing with the pandemic and all the disruption that's happened from that, it's been hard to have much planning going on about the rest of it. And I think one of the things we've gotten out of our research, and then some of the work that John and I have been doing, I've said this already today, it keeps on getting back to community. And what we're trying to do is connect it. The more that people connect, you don't need fancy information. You need to have sat down with the other businesses in your local community and talked about how you can help each other if something happens. And sort of that I think isn't happening very much right now. And to me, it's the one thing that we need to do more of if we really want to get this. Mitigation helps. All those physical things help. Building codes are incredibly important. But in the end, whether or not the community survives and the way in which the community survives is going to be how much we're helping each other.
Great, thank you so much. And on that note, I would like to invite everyone to continue this conversation with us. John just shared his contact information and I will share mine as well. We all represent various communities, small businesses, we represent various cities. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to partner together and continue this conversation, whether it's in sharing resources, learning from one another. So let's please continue this momentum. Once again, thank you to Dr. Lucy Jones and John for presenting. You both are truly experts in this field, so thank you for your expertise and your guidance, and of course for being a partner with us within Together for LA and helping us spread this message to both small businesses and community leaders. So thank you so much for all the great work you do for our communities. And thank you to all the organizations that joined us. We hope this information presented was valuable. And once again, if you missed any of the information, we will be sharing the recording of the presentation on our website, and that's laedc.org/coronavirus. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.